really becoming an engineer was just the model my father had given me. This is what you do in life. You go out and you get yourself a steady job, that kind of thing. And engineering will get you one of those. But when I told him I wanted to be a poet, he said, well, you can get a job as an engineer and be a poet in the evening. You know, that was kind of his approach.
That was Paul Finnegan, community builder for the Irish in New York. And I'm John Lee.
And I'm Martin Nutty. And welcome to another episode of Irish Stew, a podcast for the global Irish nation.
This episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by the Irish Heritage Tree Program. Celebrate your Irish roots by planting native trees for family and friends in the beautiful Golden Vale of Ireland. Go to irishheritagetree.com and use the exclusive discount code today. It's IrishStew10 for 10% off. That code again is IrishStew and the numeral 10. Keep the heritage of Ireland green and growing by going to irishheritagetree.com.
Hey folks, this is Martin Nutty with the Irish Stew podcast, and welcome to another edition. I'm joined here in our virtual studio with John Lee. John, how are you, man?
Doing well. Very looking forward to speaking to our guest today. You know, he's a friend of ours. And it's Paul Finnegan. And Paul is a guy who is in service to New York's Irish community. And that's not a title he wears lightly. He was the longtime director of the New York Irish Center. He's now working with the Irish Echo, in the New York's oldest newspaper, and really a media entity here in New York, working in business development. He was the Irish Business Organization. He's a very strong member. He was named the Sean McNeill Award winner last year, and that goes to someone who best exemplifies a great fallen IBO stalwart, Sean McNeill, and he exemplifies the IBO motto of network, reciprocate, and communicate. He's the current first vice president, and now he's the president-elect of the Irish Business Organization, taking over from a guy named John Lee. Welcome, Paul.
Hey, welcome, John, and welcome, Martin. I'm glad to jump on.
You know, I forgot to mention, Paul, you are also, besides being a friend of Irish Stew, you're also a bitter rival for New York-based diaspora-themed podcast supremacy.
Yeah, as you like to say, the bitter crosstown rival. So I'm out in Queens, and you guys are in Manhattan. So maybe it's not so much a Mets-Yankee rivalry as a Dodgers-Giants rivalry, you know? So.
Got it.
I'm not sure those baseball comparisons will actually float particularly well in Ireland, Paul.
They will,
might need to come up with something
they will completely,
a little more transatlantic appropriate.
They'll go over like a lead balloon, I believe is the expression. Yeah. So what would a similar analogy be? Dublin Kerry or something along those lines. Or Dublin Mayo in recent years, perhaps. So.
Well, until recent years, there was nothing that compared to Dublin, speaking as a, born, bred and buttered Dubliner. But obviously, my home county got its comeuppance this year, but we will be back.
Temporary.
Exactly. But let's kick this thing off. Amongst your, non-podcast activities, you are currently working for the Irish Echo. A lot of the listeners may not actually be familiar with that publication. Obviously, if you're over on this side of the Atlantic, especially in New York, you are. So that's a fairly recent introduction into the media space. How did you fetch up there the past few months?
Well, after more than a decade running the New York Irish Center, I spent a little time this year sort of moving in a couple of different directions. And one road I went down was to talk to a lot of people, informational interviews. I'm at a stage in my so-called career where I wanted to take a step back. The timing was right, pandemic notwithstanding. And I was able to just take a little breather. But I can tell you right now, I was more busier than ever for some reason in the past 9 months. But as part of the informational interview process, I got talking to the publisher of the Irish Echo, Marcino Mullor, a Belfast native. He's based in Belfast. And I know Marcin going back several years. In fact, at one time he did give a speech or a talk at the New York Irish Center. But I got talking to him, because I wanted to talk to as many people whose lives, I suppose, were not easily defined, and I felt mine may not be easily defined. If we can go into a little bit more of my past as the interview goes along, and through that conversation, I guess we just sort of talked through the possibility of me being of value to the operation of the Irish Echo, and that's pretty much. It wasn't particularly fast, but it wasn't particularly slow either. So over the course of 2 or 3 months, I got a little bit more involved with the Irish Echo, and then I guess it was at the end of August, I stepped into the role of director of business development at the newspaper, and I think that's very exciting because I know the Irish Echo from the day I landed in America, and the publication actually goes back to 1928, so it's the longest running Irish American news organization, continuously running. So, and it's meant a lot to Irish people coming to America over the generations. It's meant an awful lot to them. It's been a great resource. I found at least one apartment to live in through the Irish Echo, if not more. So it was, you go back to a time when we didn't have the access to information we do now. A thing like a newspaper was really where it was at, and the Irish Echo was a leader in that regard. So I've had a very warm, soft spot for the Irish Echo all these years. I always found their journalism to be of the highest quality. I've been interviewed by the Irish Echo a few times over the years, Peter McDermott especially, and I know Ray O'Hanlon as well through that process. And, so I've always thought the paper has a tremendous reach into Irish America. And so that's how that came about.
Paul, we love the Echo too. They list Irish Stew as one of their must listen to podcasts. Before we, and also the Irish Echo is more than just a print newspaper, and we can talk to you about that in a little bit. But let's kind of get you from there to here. Where you from? How'd you get here? Why'd you come?
Well, I'm a native to Galway. I'm not a native to Galway City, but I was raised in Galway City from the age of about 2.5 weeks or 3, depending when my parents were with us, which parent I talked to. But and I stayed in Galway City and grew up there until I graduated college in Galway, which was then called UCG, and now it's called Newey Galway.
Hold on, Paul. Wait a minute. Hold on. There's a 2.5 weeks, 2.5 weeks or 2.5 months, I can't remember, that are unaccounted for. Where were you?
Let me just pull out my long form birth cert here, John. Actually, yeah, my place of birth was Phoenix, Arizona, and that is sort of at odds with everything else about me. But that's the fact. My father was a civil engineer, and he was a graduate of UCG as well in the civil engineering department, and he worked in the United States for 9 to 10 years and married my mother here in New York. They actually got married at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and that's another story. But eventually he ended up working for General Electric, and his base was Phoenix, but he had to travel a lot for them. And my mother had 3 children, in quick succession, as one did in those times. And she found it hard to be with the 3 small kids when Dad was often in places like Michigan and New Jersey on projects for General Electric. And so after a few years, they decided they would seek a way to go back to Ireland and have my father. And my mother was a qualified school teacher, so they both had the opportunity to look for good employment in Ireland. So they decided to go back in the spring of 1965, which was the year I came about, but I came about towards the end of the year. But basically they had planned to come back to Galway because my father had actually secured a job teaching at UCG in the engineering department. And but then all of a sudden there was an announcement and there was another baby on the way. So they decided they'd wait for their 4th child to be born in the United States. And as soon as I was born, my father had delayed his start at UCG from the fall semester into the winter spring semester. So he had to get back. Then we all had to get back quick as soon as I was born. So we were back in Galway by Christmas. I was born in November, and we were back in Galway and in my grandmother's house by Christmas Day, 1965. So yeah, I mean, my father used to tell me I traveled the Atlantic at the age of 3 weeks or 2 weeks or whatever.
Mm.
And I know it wasn't a plain sailing. It wasn't changed planes in Atlanta or anything like that. They came up to New York and had to wait, I think, a couple of days for another flight to get to Ireland. And thankfully, as many of us have relatives in the United States, we have plenty of relatives in New York and plenty of relatives in Chicago, actually. So we were able to stay with my aunt. She was married to my uncle, actually, although he had passed on by that time. But we always knew her as Aunt Catherine. She was our landing pad in America. Years later, when my brothers and I came back to live in America, she was still there, and still she was the landing pad and the launching pad for our family in the United States. So other than just being a box on my long form birth certificate stating that I was born in the United States in Phoenix, Arizona, I really had no connection to the United States growing up. Personally, my family were not big vacationers. We didn't come back to America during my childhood, even though at one point I did beg my dad if we could go back to see America. I had no memories of it. My siblings all had memories of it, my older siblings. And of course, they like to rub it in all the time, but I didn't have those memories. So anyway, I finally got back for a summer when I was 19. And once I set foot in New York, I fell in love with the place and wanted to come back to live, which I did the following year, just after I got out of college.
Okay, before we move you back to New York, Paul, it's fairly clear to me, and from listening to the closing episode of your Centerpiece New York season 1, where you essentially did a bit on the Fahey brothers, or the Fahey brothers, as they say over this side of the Atlantic. Their story is an interesting story. Obviously, they share Galway with you, but what shines through in that podcast is your love and affection for the city of tribes. So to my way, despite the fact that you were actually born in Phoenix, I think you're a Galway man through and through, even despite however many years you've been living in New York. Is that how you see yourself still to this day?
Well, it's been a bit of a journey. When I left Ireland in 1986, and even though I had the advantage of being an American citizen, I really had become disillusioned with Ireland, because I really enjoyed growing up in Ireland. I really enjoyed secondary school. High school. I really, really enjoyed it. College experience wasn't as good, but it wasn't bad to a large degree. But coming out of college, there was no jobs. There was a tremendous recession, and it just seemed to me that we had been told we had a choice whether could stay or go, and it just didn't work out like that. And also, Ireland was, I guess, it was the dying death rattle of a conservative theocracy. And even though I have no great gripe with the Catholic Church, I just felt the society was harsh on people. For example, the year I left, there was a divorce referendum where 2-1 majority voted against divorce, which I thought was very unkind. And to a lot of people whose parents I knew, whose marriages were not in good shape, and there just seemed to be no out for them. So I felt, with the lack of employment, the lack of opportunity, the social norms of the time, the conservatism of the place, I just felt I felt it was a backward place in a lot of different ways. And the weather, of course, was atrocious. So I was happy to, and I remember landing in America and said, I'm an American citizen here. I don't ever want to go back and live in Ireland. And it's only really in the last few years, I suppose, where I've come to realize that, in fact, I had an awful wealth of good things come my way. And by the very nature of where I was born and the family I was born into. And I think the passing of my parents has made me very reflective as well. So I've gone on a slow kind of growing appreciation for Ireland, and especially for the town I grew up in. And that's really where that's come about. I feel more and more, my formative years in Galway really did shape me to be the person I am. Galway, despite everything, was a very open-minded, even though there are counterexamples, but it was a very open-minded place where you felt confident, or you felt confident about the world. You felt confident about your place in the world, and it's a very small city. And I refuse to call it a town. It's a very small city, but as I say in the episode that you mentioned there, Martin, it has the soul, it has the heart, it has the very essence of being a much bigger place. And I like to say that I traded one great city for another. So it's been a kind of a circle I've gone on to get back to appreciate Galway City.
We like to hear that. Before we get you out of Galway City in total, you were great to set us up with one of our recent guests, Vinnie Warren, who I think was a contemporary of yours in Galway. He describes a pretty lively social life when he was a bartender in Galway. And I came across the description of Galway as the graveyard of ambition. What does that mean?
Certainly, and yeah, Vinny is, he was a childhood friend. He grew up in the same parish as I. My mother was a national school teacher in the parish of Renmore, and she taught at least one of his sisters, maybe two. So he lived across the other side of the park. There's a little park where we lived. So just to mention that's the kind of mind that came out of Galway. It was a kind of a crucible of a lot of great things, including the mind of Vinnie Warren. Let me put it that way. And it was a pleasure listening to that episode, actually, a pleasure. It was really, I suggest your listeners go back and listen to that one if you haven't listened to it. Yes, Galway, where ambition goes to die. So again, I've begun to realize after many years that in fact there was to use the common Irish word, there was a lot of crack to be had in Galway, and I availed of it. So as much as I could while I was there. But it goes something like this. People who are not from Galway City may have, a career in, some company or banking or some career that's on the rise. They're on the rise. They're a go-getter. So at some point they may get posted to Galway, and because the company they work for may have a branch in Galway or a department in Galway or something. So they get to Galway, and then all of a sudden they realize that maybe this is all there is. It doesn't get any better. So the ambition they have, the rising star in the company, that sort of fizzles out, and they just become like, someone who doesn't want to leave Galway. So their ambition dies. And that's sort of the theory anyway. And I think it's true in a lot of cases, maybe not in all, but true in many.
Does their ambition die because the lifestyle in Galway is so good, or does their ambition die for other reasons?
I think it's the whole package. I mean, the quality of life, the social life, the culture, the cosmopolitan atmosphere of the place. I think it's the whole package, basically. And it's a very beautiful city. They've really done a lot with it. It has some very old parts to it. It was a Spanish trading port. It has, it was the go-to beach on the west of Ireland, Salt Hill. The schools have great tradition, great lore. There's rivalry. There's different parts of the towns have different flavor. There's now, a great suburban culture there. People live in places outside Galway City that, I frankly never had a reason to visit when I was growing up there. So it's the whole package, really, I think. The weather is pretty rough there, but everything seems to be able to cope with the weather, So, and it's on the very edge of the last real essence of Gaelic culture in Connemara and the Celtic fringe, and it's along the Great Atlantic Way, and it's beautiful. Like, it's beautiful out in Connemara and parts of Galway County as well. So there's everything wrapped in there, and occasionally, I say in my podcast that ambition may go to Galway to die, but often weather systems go to Galway to die. So that's why, they don't go easily. They come into Galway and they thrash around for weeks. But then, you might get a month where a high pressure system sits on Galway. And when the good weather hits Galway, I think it is a very, very beautiful place. And I have to say, I think it's the most beautiful place. But, but it is very, very beautiful when the fine weather comes there, But you just never know when it'll come.
It was interesting. You and I came to America around the same time. And I too, let's say, I wouldn't have described myself as a refugee from Ireland. I think disaffected is the right term. Disaffected because of the economic situation. And as you said, the conservatism of the place. But all that changed, within about 10 or 15 years. You and I both missed the Celtic Tiger. Any regrets?
Well, not particularly, because it's hard for me to put my finger on it, because during those 10 or 15 years, I was going through a lot of growth, and I still felt, a Celtic Tiger in Ireland is, there was there was similar opportunities developing in the United States. It wasn't exactly like the United States went into a deep recession. I mean, it was pretty much growing throughout the 90s as well. So on that level, there wasn't any particular regrets. I was happy for Ireland. I was very, very happy for Ireland. I've been very happy for Ireland because it has established itself as, a nation with high productivity, with a lot of opportunity, and with social progressiveness that the US could use a dose of, I think. So I'm very happy for Ireland. I know it still has its problems, and I know there are things that still sort of are echoes of a distant past. And I was very happy about the peace process, and I think that's made a huge difference. And let's hope it holds through through the challenges of Brexit, of course. Very, very important that it holds, and that there's no hard border. So I don't know. I have nothing but I have nothing but a positive feeling about what Ireland's gone through, and I visited it, enough to see the changes. If I had lived there continuously, I might not have noticed the changes as profoundly as I did by just visiting, every year. And sometimes I didn't go back for several years, but I could see there were quantum jumps, and it certainly makes me think about maybe going back there to live later now, but I don't know. I haven't really gotten to any real. I haven't gotten down that road too deeply at the moment, anywhere too far where I'm going to end up living in later years. But I wouldn't rule it out. Whereas for a long time, I would have ruled out ever going back to live in Ireland.
Okay, Paul. Well, before we send you back to Ireland, let's plug you back into the USA when you arrived here, and rather than sort of step through the various stages, Martin and I like to explore various forms of a kind of global Irish identity.
Yeah.
And what were your encounters like when you started encountering Irish America as opposed to newly arrived Irish in America?
Well, I think because of my somewhat different origins, I've always felt that Irish Americans were there was a kinship from the get go. When I started to meet my cousins for the first time, I just felt connected to them. I think that when you first come to America from Ireland, you meet people that are many, many generations removed from Ireland, but they describe themselves as Irish. And, you know, you kind of, in the early years you're in the United States, you say, well, you know, they're not really Irish. They're Irish Americans. And there's nothing wrong with being Irish American. They're not really Irish like you would understand, you know, what your frame of reference tells you Irish is, you know, so at that time. But somewhere along the line, you've crossed this little point and you meet native Irish people all the time and you meet Irish Americans all the time. And there doesn't seem to be a difference, you know, when someone tells you they're Irish, that's it. You know, you just understand it's part of being Irish. You know, Irish Americans who are awake to the fact that they are descendants of Irish people, and have probably visited Ireland on a greater frequency than I have, and are very familiar with, you know, Ireland and modern Ireland and all of that. You know, you just sort of you don't even feel the difference anymore. So I think another way to answer the question is I basically felt at home in New York as soon as I landed, because I felt there's this I describe it as like a background noise of positive energy towards the Irish all around New York, especially. And I just felt at home, and I felt for the first time as proud to be Irish. I really felt I felt pride in being Irish that I hadn't felt growing up in Ireland, because I think we were always the peasant neighbor to the UK and to the might of the British Empire. You know, of course, that doesn't factor in anymore. And people growing up in Ireland today probably wouldn't feel it like we would have felt it, Martin and I. But landing in New York, it was like the Irish had done so many things in this country to be really proud of. And there's such a case to be made that they were very formative in the United States and the democracy that it has. And, you know, so many good things about the United States the Irish played a role in, that I felt pride in being Irish, real pride in being Irish for the first time. So I thank Irish America for that, you know. And as I said, I could meet someone who's from Ireland. I could meet someone who's Irish American, and I don't really, something in me doesn't differentiate in terms of the Irish identity between them anymore.
That doesn't necessarily hold true in my experience of Irish people when they deal with American visitors of Irish origin. A lot of times I would hear in Dublin when somebody, you'd hear this, you know, very strong American accent as a kid growing up, and them saying, I'm Irish. And you know, the dub looks at them and says, no, you're not.
Well, I agree with that, Martin.
I don't blame them.
There is a tension there. Well, it certainly happened frequently enough, or I saw it frequently enough in Dublin. And there is a tension to some degree, I believe, between the Irish of Ireland and the Irish in America. Now, it could be that it's different in Galway, right? Maybe all us dubs are cynics, you know, or maybe, you know, there's something else at play. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I agree with you, Martin. I mean, when I go back to Ireland, I'm a Yank now. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, you know, I mean, I don't think I have a particularly pronounced American accent, but I probably have, you know. I know I have. And when I go back to Ireland, I don't expect people to see me as the boy that went to Scoilursa National School and Scoil National School, and then, you know, the St. Joseph's Patrician Brothers on Nuns Island in Galway, and then went on to UCG. I'm just somehow kind of different, and I'm outside I'm a Yank. I'm a returned. If I went back to live there, I'd be known as a returned Yank, and that's a classification all of its own.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think Irish people going back, you know, will have probably a more difficult time feeling accepted than that go back to live and set down roots there again. And that's something I would have to think about if I ever wanted to go back and live there. I'd have to understand that. I think they have a harder time getting that acceptance as, as being bona fide, if that's the right word, citizens of Ireland. Whereas, an Irish person coming here can blend in pretty quickly in the Irish American community. I think anyway, I think they're almost celebrated and certainly warmly welcomed. So yeah, I agree with you there. And it's a sort of a tension, but I mean, there were years when I went back to visit and I just felt I felt like hard done by that people would see me that way, because I had, some of the people I met weren't even born when I lived there. So it's like, I know this place better than you, but you're treating me like an outsider, that kind of thing. But I just put that aside. I mean, it is what it is at this stage, so I can't blame anyone for seeing me the way they see me when I go back to Ireland, because there's a lot of truth in it.
Paul, when you got over here, we talked a little bit about the New York Irish Center, but what are some of the things you did to keep Paul Finnegan Enterprises moving forward?
Oh gosh, I wish I had, I wish I had a clear destination in mind throughout the course of my life. At one time, I used to say that I specialize in career changes. So I came here. I graduated with mechanical engineering from Galway, and I was a pseudo mechanical engineer for about 2 years, because the only work I could find in New York, and I didn't want to leave New York, was in the HVAC business, which is air conditioning and heating and things
ventilation.
Like that. Yeah. And if ever there was
ductwork,
ductwork, yes. If ever there was an inexact science, it's it's anything to do with people feeling comfortable with the temperature in a room. So I mean, it just is very hard to deal with that, because there's no right answer. So when you're an engineer, you're kind of taught to come up with the right answer. You're able to solve an equation or something. There is a right answer, but it just didn't work out like that. So after a couple of years, I felt I wasn't never going to be an engineer, to be honest with you. I just happened to get streamed into it by Irish society, which is another reason I felt a little restricted over there. Anyway, that long story short, I jumped from there, and to keep paying the rent, I jumped into teaching, and that was a very happy phase of my life. I taught for 6 years in the New York City public schools, all in one school in Sunnyside.
Grade school,
middle school. They call it middle school.
Yep.
It was like the second half of elementary school, basically. And it was a great experience, and most of the kids I had were minority Spanish, Asian, some African Americans. It was definitely a mosaic of kids and cultures. And I have many, many great recollections of those years. It was in Sunnyside, which was still, or well, it probably still is today, a pretty Irish area, but the kids were from all over. And one thing I did notice though is they didn't seem to have nicknames for their teachers like we did growing up in Ireland, in Galway. I mean, a teacher all a teacher had to do there was display one particular attribute, and that became their nickname, for all eternity. But over here, it didn't seem to work like that. But something funny happened in the early 90s. A band called House of Pain came out with a song called Jump Around, and they were like an Irish American band up in Boston. And it was a very popular song among all cultures. And these Spanish kids came up to me. They were in my class. They came up to me after class one day, and they were like, "Mr. Finnegan, are you Irish?" And I was like, yes, I am Irish. Well, this is a great band, and they're Irish. They're called House of Pain, and they have this great song, Jump Around. So long story short there, I ended up with a nickname, Shamrock Number One. And that became my nickname in that school. So anyway, to continue my career journey anyway, I talk about finding community and finding a place and where I felt at home. And That happened a lot around Woodside and Sunnyside in those years for me because there was a lot of undocumented Irish. I got involved with people that were trying to help the undocumented. There was a group called the Irish Immigration Reform Movement that I did some foot soldier work for. They had great leaders. I addressed that in one of my podcast episodes when I highlighted the work of Sean Benson. But one of the outgrowths of the Irish Immigration Reform Movement, the IIRM, was the Emerald Isle Immigration Centre. So it was just a great place to be involved with, and it was a very small operation, mostly volunteers, but it was also a huge part of my social life for a few years. And uh, I started doing a project with them where I introduced college opportunities primarily to the undocumented Irish, and I held meetings and seminars that would introduce them to the fact that they could go to CUNY, the city university, even though they were undocumented, and they could pay the in-city tuition, which was very, very cheap. So actually, to this day, I still hear about people that took up the opportunity of getting an education. These would have been people who were wait staff in diners and minding children, had no college education from Ireland, but had usually had a very strong secondary education by many standards, and went on to have, other careers outside of, with opportunities and long-term benefits and things like that. So that was very gratifying. But along the way, Sean Benson decided to step away from his role as executive director. He was the first executive director of Emerald Isle Immigration Centre. And I jumped in and put my name in the hat. And I just mentioned Dan Dennehy here, good long-term friend of mine, Siobhan's husband, Dan. I remember I was talking to Dan, saying, shuffling from one foot to the other. I said, Dan, I think I'll put my name in for that job, And he said, now, Paul, just stand up straight, put your shoulders back and say, I want that job. And I did, and I got the job. And I have to credit Dan for probably, a lot of my years of, working with the Irish community in New York would have a lot to do with Dan telling me to grab it, and don't vacillate. But Emerald Isle was a lot smaller than it is now, but I'm happy to say that I think I made a difference for about 4 years. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, I'm not sure I can really have the things I want in life, like a family and all that, if I stay there. So I started studying at night. I started studying computers because, the computer age was taking off, I suppose. The internet was taking off, and I thought that was exciting. So I got a master's at Baruch College along the way, and then I went into that business. And I stayed in a kind of an information systems computer business for that world for about 12 years. And they were good years as well. Got married. My wife, Rosa, who's native to the Dominican Republic. Actually, she was born there and she was raised here. So she was a Queen's gal on many levels. And anyway, that world came to an end for a number of reasons that I won't go into here, but all of a sudden it was the Great Recession. And out of the blue, because of my community ties, I was very close to a guy called Father Colum Campbell, and he had started the New York Irish Centre, and he basically said there's an opening, and would I jump in? And I just said, yeah, why not? Give me, I was kind of at the end of I had kind of gotten a little bit tired of the computer business by then, and I jumped in, and it was a new project, and I said I'd do it for 5 years, and after 11 years, I finally decided I'd done it long enough. But that was also a tremendous chapter in my life because, we did so much there in the time I was there, from developing the building to making it a sustainable entity, taking away the debt on the building and developing all these different programs and just meeting a multitude of great people, just a multitude, and having so many great days and evenings there over the years. And, my wife was very involved when my kids were smaller. They spent a lot of time there. So, it was very happy to look back on. I'm very proud of everything that we accomplished at the New York Irish Centre. The board there, tremendous people that are tremendously successful, but you'll never know who they are because they're not interested in any of that, any of the limelight, but very, very keen to see the New York Irish Centre be a place where people can get help. And, when I think about it, like, developed a partnership with Solace House and gave them, I gave them a foot in the door in America because they actually were an outgrowth of Pieta House and Joan Freeman's work in Ireland. And, their leader now is, their CEO is Rebecca Sked, who was actually working for me for many years till she was able to transition into that role and lead Solace House. So that's another thing we did, which, at the New York Irish Centre, which I, want to point out during my tenure, tremendously proud of that because there's such a need for the work they do. Absolutely. And the seniors, of course, we provided such an environment for the seniors, which they continue to provide to this day under the leadership of George Heslin. And of course, many seniors passed away in my time there, but I would say we really enriched the last years of their lives tremendously, and will continue to. They will continue to do so, of course.
So it's interesting, Paul, that you took some of those interactions with the seniors in the New York Irish Centre, and that ultimately became the basis of Centerpiece New York. Was that part of the master plan, or again, this is part of Paul Finnegan evolving from one thing to another? Because you seem to have gone from an engineer to a teacher to an administrator to an IT person, back to a kind of nonprofit administrator as well. But the one thing that didn't seem to have been ticked in that whole movement, and you kind of circle back a couple of times, it seems to me, was something that was maybe a bit more creative is the wrong word, but maybe in the art space, right? Creativity in the art space was a box that you hadn't ticked. Was that a yen that you had, and you saw that opportunity with the seniors and the life stories that they kind of exposed to you?
Well, I wouldn't say it was exactly that, Martin, but you're on to something. I remember when I was doing my leaving cert in Galway, I wanted to be a poet. And I don't think that part of me ever left, ever left the building, basically. I've dabbled in writing over the years. I've never tried to really get anything published, seriously tried to get anything published, but I've felt that has always been a very big part of me. When I was, growing up, I didn't have a great like of mathematics. I wasn't that, drawn towards the sciences. So really becoming an engineer was just, the model my father had given me. This is what you do in life. You go out and you get yourself a steady job, that kind of thing. And engineering will get you one of those, But when I told him I wanted to be a poet, he said, well, you can get a job as an engineer and be a poet in the evening. That was kind of his approach. And came from a very real upbringing during the Depression, and my mother likewise. And I think all of us who grew up in Ireland in the 60s and 70s had parents that felt they were only one step away from destitution. It's just sort of the way they were raised. So that's who I am. And when you say I was an administrator, I don't think I've ever been an administrator. I just happen to be good at getting things done on time, even if they're boring forms. I've never been. I think that all my roles have had a very strong creative element to them. What I didn't tell you is during my computer years, I was basically working for a company, and I became a management investor. So it was a very creative process to help that company grow and thrive. And we were able to grow the company several times over by the time I left and by the time we exited. So there's just so many things where I think that the essence of happiness is about creativity. When I was a school teacher, I tried to be as creative in my teaching as possible. And when with the New York Irish Center, that was just all bets were off. I was just kind of on my own on so many levels. The board were fantastic, but they were mostly dealing with making sure the place was properly financed. And that was great because then I really had a canvas to work on. So there was a social creativity that I invested my time in there. So yeah, so coming to the end of my time at the New York Irish Center, George was ready to step in, and I was very happy that he wanted to step in because he was perfect for carrying on the work of so many people and making sure it continued to thrive, which it has. And I'm so happy when I think about the New York Irish Center and what he's done with it even in the last year and where I know he'll take it from here. But yeah, I've had an interest in audio for several years, so it was a hobby, but I wasn't doing much with it. And then, George says, "Why don't you do a podcast with our seniors?" So that was the start of it. And I felt like everything else, you kind of know you're going in a particular direction, but you're not sure. But the direction I felt I was going in was let's celebrate the people that made Irish in New York, made the Irish in New York identity, the Irish American identity in New York so strong and so positive, such that, when St. Patrick's Day swings around, everybody wants to say they're Irish, they, it's a city thing. It's New York as much as it is Irish, and that's what the Irish have given to the city. Just a sense of a sense of this is a good place. New York is, and I think that comes a lot from the Irish. And so I wanted to somehow magnify that through a podcast. So there was the medium was audio, which I love, and the subject matter was something I was very very close to. And John, you and I have talked, and you've said how you're in communications, but you had done many different things before that. But the one common kind of track through all that was the word communications, and you kind of homed in on that. And I think I'm starting to home in on something similar in that my track through this world is basically what putting my hands into the Irish American identity, especially in New York. I think that has a lot to do with that's the that's kind of the basis of a lot of my thinking now. So the podcast started off like that, and I think it started off with a few great seniors that I knew and love, and they didn't have to be people that anybody else knew. They didn't have to be people that had any level of high profile in the community. And we have so many great people with really high profiles in the community, but that wasn't the focus. The focus was basically just by going about your life, you basically created an environment for Irish people to come here and to thrive and to be accepted and to be to I don't know if it's an advantage, but at least get your foot in the door in places just based on the positive, good reputation of your people. And I was very happy with how it started to evolve. And now it doesn't matter if the person is young or old or famous or not famous. It's the central theme is that, uh, your life is exemplary, whether people know a lot about it or not. I just finished an episode with Adrian Flannelly.
Yep, that's great, really good. I just finished listening to it today.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a guy everybody knows, but I don't think everybody knows his story. And now I've had a chance for it to be out there a little bit,
Yeah. Well, everybody needs to listen to Centerpiece NY. It's a different kind of podcast than we do. It's a more highly produced, a little bit more of like a kind of an NPR feel to it. Really, really good. And Paul, we talked the other day about a kind of a similar feeling both of us had when you heard we were doing this sort of Irish themed podcast out of New York, and you were kind of like, oh, damn it. And then I confess we had the same feeling when we heard you were doing it. And actually, we both decided that the rising tide lifts all boats. We're having a good time kind of playing off each other.
John, I told you not to admit to that.
Well, I'm happy to talk about it. Well, first of all, I just want to reference a story my comedic cousin Colm O'Regan in Ireland tells about. It's part of his shtick, I suppose, his stage performance, his stand up. When he was leaving secondary school, there was always the threat that he would have to repeat the leaving cert. Maybe he wouldn't get as much as he needed in terms of the college points. And these are things that people in the United States may not be that familiar with, but there's a system over there where you have very tough exams right at the end of your secondary level education, and depending on how you do, you score points, and those points will qualify you for different courses. So anyway, you're in your last year of high school, and it's all down to a few exams at the end of during the month of June. So naturally, you're gonna have some worries that you might not measure up. It's like the big game: you perform or you don't perform. Anyway. So he was thinking, if I have to repeat, then I'll be a year behind all my friends going to college. And by the time I get there, all the crack will be used up, all the crack will be gone. So it's sort of like that. So you always have that feeling with so I was bringing out a podcast, and then news came over the airwaves that John Lee and Martin Nutty were going to have a podcast. And, I think I heard the preview or something, and I was like, oh, guys, you guys have such a... you've got everything going there. You got the balance. You got the back and forth, the chemistry. You're going to go down. And I wasn't even sure if the themes you were going to touch upon would be the same as I had planned. That I'd just be replicating what you were doing and things like that. So anyway, but then I settled back into thinking, it's a growing market. And there's lots of space, and there's lots of space in this space, and I'm just going to go ahead with it. And essentially, I just fell back on that thing about creativity. Well, I'll do it for myself, and if people want to listen to it, that's fine. And if they don't, they don't. But as long as I'm happy with the product, and I feel gratified that I've done it, and I continue to do it, then that's okay. And I think that's the way it's worked out. Actually, I have a growing audience. But it's a particular kind of audience, I think, that might be drawn to what I'm trying to do. And you guys are, your output is, there's a lot more output on your podcast than mine. But, I just settled down to a level that I could produce, which is one a month, basically. So that's my, that's my goal, to keep up that and do a 10 episode season, and then take a month or two off in the summer or something along those lines. We'll see, but that's exactly it. I mean, and I'm just, it's just funny that you guys would have even had any tremor at all about me. I mean, that's very flattering, actually. Very flattering altogether. But anyway, we've decided to be bitter crosstown rivals, as we said earlier. But the truth is, we're supporting each other, and we're trying to broaden the support net. There's one or two other great Irish podcasts, Irish in America, in New York, podcasters out there, and we try to support each other as much as possible. And we're forming Local 42B of the Podcasters Union. So anyway, podcasters of the world unite.
Yes, we will be putting out a notice on the next meeting. We've already had our inaugural session in Midtown Manhattan at the Fahey Brothers Bar, St. Patrick's. So there will be a follow-up to that. And so keep tuned. But we're getting to that point in the podcast where we need to introduce you to Seamus Plug. Now, Seamus Plug is a lovely fellow. Actually, it's not really... Seamus Plug was actually a shameless plug originally, and I converted it into a being. And so it's that point, Paul, where you need to, or if you wish to, encourage our listeners to tune into something that's of particular interest to you as our guest. So what would that be?
Well, I thought about this, and I have a few things I'd like to mention. First of all, real quick, and I'll finish up then with something which is more particular to my thinking. So I would like to say the Irish Business Organization is something that I think more people should be involved with in an active way. So I'm promoting that as president-elect. I'm promoting that as a great way to spend your time. And I also want to give a nod to John. John brought me in to the board is during the course of 2019. And I really appreciate that. And I've really enjoyed working with the board as first VP, and looking forward to leading and building on what John has done in next year. He brought me in 2020. Actually, the year's become a blur now with the pandemic, but throughout 2021 and some of 2020, I was involved in the board for the first time.
Well, let's see if you thank me a year from now, Paul.
Yeah, I know, right? I want to mention the Irish Echo. I think it's a significant component of Irish America, and I'm trying to help strengthen it with Martin O'Mullor, help strengthen it as a business, but also as an editorial, as a product, which I think is a significant voice in Irish America. I want to mention a group called the Celtic Irish American Academy, which is in Galway, which helps bring kids from the United States to Ireland and give them an immersion in Irish culture for a couple of weeks. And I think these programs are very important because, you don't have as much of a steady flow from Ireland to the United States as you would have had back in the day. And there's a million reasons for that, which I don't need to go into right now. But I still think that the connection between Ireland and America is very important to the Irish American identity, which benefits Ireland. So the Celtic Irish American Academy in Galway, which pops up on my podcast from time to time. And that brings me to my podcast, Centerpiece NY. Please tune in once a month. I'll try to keep the episodes at a manageable 1 hour or less. I'm not quite getting there, but I try to make them as engaging as possible because I value your time as a listener in this busy, distracting world. So centerpieceny.com. Go there and you can find out everything you ever wanted to know, but were afraid to ask about my podcast. I think there's a lot in that in terms of tribute, the world of tributes. So I think there's a growing market in people wanting a decent tribute for their loved ones. So that's another angle too. And that's something I want to promote is actually, if you are interested in a tribute to someone you love or someone you care about, contact me through the website and maybe we can talk about that. And my final thing is, I've often thought if I had a good team in place, I could do things. So I have a lot of great business ideas. And if you're interested in joining forces with me, just contact me through the stew, and I'll be happy to talk to you. So I'm looking for people to form a team around a couple of business ideas I have, and we'll see if there's a match. Put it that way. But I've often found myself operating as a lone wolf, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that I haven't been fortunate enough to meet the right people at the right time. But anyone who knows me through my many roles in life knows that I work well with people, and I think I'm a pretty decent person a good, productive person to work with. So if you're looking for a business partner, give me a shout and we can talk and we'll see where it takes us. That's the end of my shameless litany.
Shameless litany. That might be the most
shameless plug, and I plugged it right into the wall.
I think you used a shameless family at that point.
Yeah. You really worked it. We might have to retire the plug after that. No, that was probably the most interesting.
Yeah, that's it.
Seamus plug of all. And I was thinking, like we were talking about how we came up with the Seamus plug. Maybe your fellow Galwegian Vinnie Warren could come up with sort of an advertising thing around our shameless plug. I could see him having fun with that. And we've mentioned Vinnie Warren a few times. If you haven't listened to the episode, he's known for the commercial, the Budweiser commercials. What's up? A really creative genius in advertising. So there's our shameless plug. Be sure to listen to that episode, and be sure to listen to Centerpiece NY after you've listened to Irish Stew. It's well worth your while, and it's been great getting to know you, Paul. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Paul. Hey, John, great conversation with Paul, and thinking about it in a little bit more detail, or something that really stood out to me in that conversation was at some point I said to Paul, did you start the podcast to scratch the creative impulse? And Paul pushed back on that, and I think in a nice way, reminding me that all the various ventures that he's been involved, much of his success has been driven by generating creative solutions to the problems that have been presented to him, whether that's being involved in the Legalize the Irish, when he was involved in the whole immigration effort, or whether that's involved in the New York Irish Center and putting out a new program that will draw all the Irish together. He is, in many respects, creative in many different areas and facets, and he makes for a real stalwart in the New York Irish community that people look up to.
Yeah, that's for sure. When you say creative, you look at a lot of the things he got involved with weren't there before, or they were in the very early stages, and he was helping carving out the role for these organizations and helping them grow. And even right now at the Irish Echo, business development, that's a new role there for an old institution, but a new face that I'm sure he'll help put on the Echo. And it was fun talking to our bitter crosstown rival about podcasting. We both are covering kind of the same ground, but we go at it so differently. So I think anybody who listens to us would like to listen to Centerpiece NY, and hopefully vice versa.
Yeah, really enjoy bouncing ideas off Paul, and he's actually admitted to the same. But just to talk back to our listeners a little bit, if you've been enjoying these conversations that we've been having, why don't you give us a follow on Twitter? We hang out there a good bit, both John and I. You can find us at Irish Stewcast on Twitter, and we always welcome feedback on this episode or any other episode or any ideas you might have about the podcast. So I look forward to seeing you on Twitter at Irish Stewcast. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.